We have a huge update here as far as one of Donald Trump's more high-profile vindictive prosecutions is concerned. It's somebody that's in the independent media space. Glenn, can you explain what the new update is as far as Don Lemon's prosecution is concerned?
Yeah, Brian, here we go again. A judge just ordered the Department of Justice to turn over all the grand jury evidence and information for her to review to see if there was prosecutorial misconduct before the grand jury. Where have we seen this movie before? Well, let's see. The first prosecution against James Comey was dismissed because of improprieties in the grand jury, as was the case against Letitia James, as was the case against the Broadview 6 protesters in Chicago, as was the case against David Hearn in the, infamous reflecting pool caper. I mean, over and over and over again, Donald Trump's dirty DOJ officials are sending these ethics-free prosecutors into the grand jury. Often these are people who were just brought to the Department of Justice specifically to kind of be part of Donald Trump and Todd Blanche's corrupt cabal, people who are willing to do Donald Trump's bidding to, weaponize the Department of Justice to go after Trump's perceived evidence, even though they committed no crime. Donald Trump and Todd Blanche seem to be of the opinion, evidence, schmevidence, we're going to indict Donald Trump's perceived enemies. And they went after Don Lemon, another independent journalist out in Minneapolis, Georgia Fort, and a couple of dozen others. Why? Well, because they learned that a pastor at a particular church was involved in ICE enforcement, specifically back during that extreme immigration enforcement operation in Minneapolis. You remember the one that produced the deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And we saw, captured on cell phone cameras over and over and over again, ICE running roughshod over the constitutional rights of the people who were protesting this reckless immigration enforcement operation. There was an indication that a pastor at a particular church was sort of involved in those immigration enforcement operations. So a series of people got together and they decided to mount a protest at that pastor's church. Now, here is what's most important for our viewers to know. These independent journalists, Don Lemon, former CNN, now an independent journalist, and local Minneapolis journalist Georgia Fort, they were covering the protest. And what is most absurd from this old prosecutor's perspective is they indicted not only Don Lemon, Georgia Fort, and many others who were protesting at the church. They indicted Don Lemon for, blocking access of the parishioners, the worshipers, to, worship in the church of their choice under something called the FACE Act. And yet Don Lemon actually live streamed his own conduct. Are we really to believe that Don Lemon was live streaming his own felonies as he was committing them? Most importantly, we hear him on the live stream saying, whoa, I'm covering this protest. I'm a journalist. I'm not with the protesters. And, they went ahead and they indicted Don Lemon, Georgia Fort, and a whole bunch of other people in any event. But then, the judge got wind that there may have been some improprieties before the grand jury, and Don Lemon's lawyers filed a motion arguing, Judge, look at the pattern of grand jury abuse that has been perpetrated by Donald Trump's Department of Justice. So the judge ultimately ordered the DOJ to produce all of the grand jury materials, not just the transcripts of witness testimony, but all of the audio recordings of every word that was said in the grand jury, including what the prosecutors said to the grand jurors, including the questions that the grand jurors asked of the prosecutors and how they answered those questions. And this is the exact blueprint that led all of those other cases to fall apart and be dismissed. James Comey, Letitia James, the Broadview 6, the David Hearn prosecution. And here we go again. Now we have to wait to see what the judge finds in those grand jury transcripts to see if she decides to dismiss all of these cases that are presently pending up in Minnesota.
A quick note for those who are watching, if you appreciate our legal analysis, the best way to see more of it is to subscribe to both of our channels. Completely free to subscribe, but a great way to show some support for the work that we do. So those links are right in the post description of this video. Glenn, worth asking here, what was the impetus for the judge here to demand any of the information related to these prosecutions? Was it apropos of nothing? Was it apropos of previous vindictive prosecutions? Or was there something that actually happened that made the judge feel that it was warranted to suddenly seek this information?
I think it's an aggregate of everything that we have come to learn of Donald Trump's dirty Department of Justice officials, because there is clearly a pattern that has emerged over the the spectrum of cases that I just listed, where it's clear that Donald Trump has managed to find an attorney general and a number of United States attorneys around the country who are willing to abuse the grand jury process, who are willing to engage in prosecutorial overreach and misconduct before the grand jurors, because there's a well-established record in multiple cases of that. And I think I haven't read all of the pleadings that led up to this ultimate ruling by the judge, but I do think part of what goes into it is, but Brian, I think a large part of it is the following, and this is probably not intuitive to people. When prosecutors go into grand juries, I did it for literally decades as a federal prosecutor, we wear two hats. We are the traditional prosecutor. What does that look like? Well, we present the incriminating evidence and information to the grand jurors. That's witness testimony. That's crime scene photos. It's police reports. It's the results of any forensic testing that was conducted. But we wear a second hat. We are also the legal advisors to the grand jury. That's a term of art. What does that mean? It means that we have to play it straight with the grand jurors, not even really be advocates, which is the traditional role of the prosecutor. And what we have to do is say, ladies and gentlemen, we are asking you in this case, for example, to vote out 2 felony charges against Don Lemon, Georgia Fort, and the others, and let us list for you the elements of each of those crimes. Each crime is made up of several elements, and the prosecutors have to present evidence, admissible evidence, on each of those elements to satisfy the jury that we actually have probable cause to indict and we have a reasonable likelihood of a conviction at trial. That is the DOJ standard for a prosecutor to go forward and request an indictment, even though probable cause is the legal standard for the grand jurors to vote in favor of an indictment. And we have to play it straight. We frankly almost have to be judge-like, because if our evidence is lacking on a particular element of a particular crime, we have to raise that with the grand jury and discuss it. If the defendant has a defense to the crime, we have to address that. We're responsible for providing not only incriminating evidence to the grand jury, but what's called exculpatory evidence, evidence that is helpful to the defendant that might provide a defense to the charges that we're looking to indict. And here is where the rubber meets the road, Brian, and I have a feeling this may be a large part of what prompted the judge to order the disclosure of all grand jury materials to the judge privately, not giving it to the defense yet. We know because we saw with our own eyes Don Lemon's live stream, when Don Lemon said things that support the reality, the fact that he was exercising his First Amendment rights of freedom of the press when he was covering that protest at the church. In fact, he said so expressly. Hey, I'm covering this. I'm a journalist. I'm not with the group. And to argue that he is somehow complicit with what other people may have done, which I'm not suggesting was criminal, we'll hear more about that in the future, but is contradicted squarely by a contemporaneous audio-video recording of what Don Lemon was doing. And if that's not enough to raise a judge's concern that the second hat that the prosecutors are required to wear in the grand jury, legal advisor to the grand jury, somehow the prosecutors may have, let's put it generously, fallen down on their job as legal advisors to the grand jury to talk about that defense Don Lemon likely has to these criminal charges, then I don't know what evidence would satisfy the judge. So I think it was probably, in aggregate, everything that we have come to know, not only in the context of the evidence in this case, but of DOJ's habit, practice, proclivity to abuse the grand jury to make sure that dear leaders, commands are obeyed, and that they use the powers of the Department of Justice to go after Trump's perceived enemies.
Is there a world where the judge can look at, I would say, the evidence, but the lack of evidence, and just dismiss this outright? Like, would that be best case scenario for Don Lemon and other folks?
Well, that is exactly the world in which the Broadview 6 protesters in Chicago found themselves. Because there was evidence of irregularities before the grand jury, the judge ordered DOJ to produce all of the grand jury transcripts. And Brian, they fought mightily against it. And I won't catalog all of the bullshit arguments they made as to why the judge shouldn't be permitted to see what they did in the grand jury. They went so far as dismissing charges themselves to try to thwart the judge's efforts to see what the hell they did in the grand jury, but they failed. And when the judge saw it all, the judge dismissed all the cases against the Broadview 6, but the judge went a step further. I believe this was Judge April Perry, and what she did was she also ordered the Department of Justice to pay for the defendant's legal fees. In fact, Brian, the Department of Justice gave up the ghost and they said, Judge, we'll pay for their legal fees. Boy, if that is not an admission of wrongdoing by these hack DOJ lawyers, I don't know what is.
All right, so then last question here. Why does the administration, recognizing how doomed this whole effort is, why is it important for them to go through this whole charade anyway? What benefit do they derive by virtue of engaging in a process that's basically doomed to fail?
Well, they're probably all trying to avoid having Donald Trump throw them under the bus, as he has so many of his other cabinet officials or officers who displease him because they don't carry out his lawless demands to get after his Trump's enemies, right? We're seeing it play out in real time with Jeanine Pirro. She's not successfully prosecuting the innocent David Hearn. So there is some reporting that she may be on the chopping block. Pam Bondi didn't carry out Donald Trump's, campaign of vindictiveness, so she got thrown under the bus. So why is DOJ going through it? Probably because some sort of cowardly U.S. attorney out there is not wanting to find himself as the next one Donald Trump throws under the bus. At least that's a reasonable inference I think we can draw.
Yeah. Well, we will, of course, stay on top of this. If for nothing else, then we have some other folks in the independent media space who deserve attention, just like every other person who is the victim of a weaponized Department of Justice does. So if you want to follow along with what's happening, the best way to do that is to subscribe to both of our channels. I'm going to put those links right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Teller Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.